The Germans, Wallenstein, and the war. In the middle of Europe during the second millennium, a land takes a long time to become united. Its people gradually come to identify as Germans over the centuries. Who are we? Where do we come from? These are questions posed over a millennium of German history. It is a struggle over faith and power, Catholics against Protestants. General Albrecht von Wallenstein is tasked with defeating the followers of Luther for the Emperor. The Germans share a common fate as their land becomes a battleground and a pawn of European powers. This is the most devastating war fought on this soil up to that time, costing millions of lives and devastating the land. Entire generations know only suffering and death from this war. One man who profited immensely from this war was the commander and entrepreneur Albrecht von Wallenstein. Despite his success in arms and mercenary dealings, he too becomes weary of the war. Where is the man? He has fallen. He has fallen on the battlefield. I cannot bring your husband back. Thank you, my lord. Thank you. May God bless you. Thank you. Thank you. Maybe it will bring you more luck than it did me. The war over faith, power, and money is far from over. Prague, on the eve of the 30 Years' War, becomes a hotspot in the conflict of confessions. The predominantly Protestant population is ruled by a Catholic king, an exception in the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation, where at the beginning of the 17th century, the local lords determine the confession of their subjects. The Catholic ruler wants to enforce this in the largely Protestant Bohemia. Ferdinand of Habsburg had to guarantee religious freedom to the Bohemian Protestants upon his election as king, but now wants to override this. From his Vienna residence, he instructs his governors in Prague on how Bohemia could become Catholic again. King Ferdinand's governors have approved the demolition of Protestant churches. For the Protestant representatives, this is a violation of their guaranteed religious freedom and an affront. A delegation marches to Prague Castle. Fabricius, go to the door and see. The king's representatives do not suspect what awaits them. What do you want, traitors? You disregard our faith and our rights. Heretics have no rights. Keep talking and we will silence you, godless rabble. Let me go, for heaven's sake. We have done nothing. Go to hell, you papist scoundrels. The Protestants throw the king's governors out of the window. Although the Prague defenestration ends mildly, it triggers a spiral of violence. What began as a protest for rights and freedom against Ferdinand's policies is condemned by Catholic propaganda in Vienna as a brutal attack. The Catholics attribute the survival of the governors to the intervention of the Virgin Mary. The Prague defenestration took the Viennese government by surprise. They knew there were radical Protestant estates, but did not expect such a violent outbreak against the governors. After the defenestration, the Bohemians deposed Habsburg Ferdinand as their king and elected the Protestant elector Frederick of the Palatinate as the counter-king. Ferdinand, now also Emperor of the Reich, sought allies. Duke Maximilian of Bavaria, the military leader of the Catholics, and a Catholic Bohemian of low nobility, Albrecht von Wallenstein. Habsburg ruled Spain, also sent troops to support Ferdinand. In November 1620, the Emperor's coalition fought against the Bohemian Protestants outside Prague and won the Battle of White Mountain. The Protestants were driven out, Bohemia became Catholic again, and Frederick of the Palatinate was dethroned. His electoral dignity, the right to vote for the emperor, was transferred to Maximilian of Bavaria as a reward. Ferdinand's allies continued the war for the Catholic faith and more imperial power. Power shifted on German soil. Bohemia and the Palatinate fell to the Catholics who advanced further north. Soon resistance arose among the European neighbors. The Protestant King of Denmark feared for his dominance in the Baltic region and declared war on Emperor Ferdinand. News of the Danish entry into the war spread quickly to Vienna. In the Hofburg, Emperor Ferdinand's residence, responses to the northern threat were sought. The Danish advance could not be stopped without additional troops and weapons, which the emperor lacked. Your Imperial Majesty, the Danish king advances south with 2,000 men. We must stop him. With all due respect, Majesty, we have no money for new troops. The emperor was at a loss on how to continue his fight for power and faith. Leave that to me, Your Majesty, said Wallenstein, surprising the emperor. I can provide you with an army of 50,000 men in no time. Wallenstein, I would gladly take you at your word, but how do you plan to sustain 50,000 soldiers in the field? 50,000 are easier to supply than 20,000, Your Majesty. With Wallenstein, a new era of warfare began. The occupied territories will provide for the army. The larger the army, the more money we will raise, Wallenstein explained. This formula opened the door to a total war and an unprecedented career. Wallenstein was appointed commander-in-chief of the Imperial Army, rising from lower nobility to the level of the empire's princes. Equipped with imperial powers, Wallenstein immediately began recruiting troops. The money he advanced from his own funds would be recouped in the war zones, a calculation without scruples. Wallenstein invested in new soldiers and new weapons. During the 30 Years' War, the craft of war also changed. Iron armor offered little protection on the battlefield. Firearms became increasingly important. Muskets were cumbersome, inaccurate, and difficult to operate, but were used effectively by Wallenstein's mercenaries. The loading process involved pouring in powder, ramming the bullet down the barrel, and setting the fuse. A single shot was ineffective, but volleys of musket fire could break enemy lines. Wallenstein perfected not only warfare, but also the business of war, exploiting peasants, craftsmen, merchants, and citizens who had to provide for Wallenstein and his troops, even those who had to pay for the soldiers' wages. Wallenstein's motto was that war feeds war. Like a voracious caterpillar, 50,000 soldiers marched through northern Germany, leaving the population with barely anything to live on. Many farmers and their families joined the ranks of the mercenaries out of sheer desperation to escape hunger and misery. Wallenstein did not have to worry about recruiting soldiers. His war machine took over the land. Under Wallenstein's command, the Catholics pushed back the Danish troops and occupied the Protestant north of the empire. As a reward, the emperor granted him the Duchy of Mecklenburg, a move that affronted not only Protestant rulers, but also the old ducal dynasty. In 1627, there was a meeting in Prague between the emperor, the princes, and the upstart Wallenstein. "Long live my new Duke of Mecklenburg, cover your head," said the emperor. "Honor where honor is due." The public honoring of the imperial favorite provoked the established nobility. "The emperor treats this Bohemian peasant like an ancient prince of the empire," they said. "It is an outrageous injustice to give the ducal title to someone like him," Aldringen remarked. "But as I heard, it was only your presence that led to the emperor fearing soon ruling over the princes with Wallenstein's help." The Catholics among the nobility also worried that the emperor now intended to rid himself of the old nobility and rule alone, like the King of France who sought absolute monarchy. One emperor, one realm, one faith, but only with Wallenstein's help, they thought. At the foot of Prague Castle, Wallenstein displayed how far he had risen. The Wallenstein Palace, with its grand hall and a ceiling fresco depicting the war, God Mars in his celestial ride, left no doubt who was meant. Even the stars seemed to favor him. The famous astronomer Johannes Kepler had predicted his rise, but also warned that his gain would come at many people's expense. Enmity and resistance were inevitable. Wallenstein often recalled the prophecy, wondering when fate would turn against him. By the 11th year of the war, he had more to lose than to gain. The war over power and faith threatened to become uncontrollable. The advance of Catholic troops to the Baltic Sea challenged the Protestant Swedes. In 1628, they defended the besieged Stralsund from Wallenstein's forces, a warning that Emperor Ferdinand did not take seriously. Instead, he sought to turn back the clock and eradicate Protestantism in the empire. "Wallenstein maintains our position in the north," Ferdinand said. "Does he not wish to command a fleet? The dominion over the seas belongs solely to the emperor. And yet, I cannot be satisfied. The heretical Protestants still control vast parts of the empire." Wallenstein retorted. "What should I do?" Ferdinand asked. "You must reclaim what they stole from the Roman Church. It is your right and holy duty," Wallenstein replied. For Ferdinand, it was not just about power and possession. It was a crusade. Under his confessor's influence, Ferdinand issued the Edict of Restitution in 1629, aiming to return all church properties seized by Protestants since 1552. This posed a significant threat to Protestant rulers, as they had expanded their territorial control based on these properties. Magdeburg, a city with a long history, became a test of his policy. Originally a Saxon settlement, it became a bishop's seat in the 10th century. In the 16th century, Protestants seized all church properties, making Magdeburg a stronghold of the Reformation. By the summer of 1629, the city was besieged by imperial troops determined to enforce Ferdinand's edict. The people of Magdeburg knew that if their resistance collapsed, the Reformation across Germany would be at risk. Delegates from the city sought to negotiate with Wallenstein, who was in command. "Your Excellency, we cannot meet the demands," they pleaded. Wallenstein had demanded 200,000 thalers for his troops in exchange for lifting the siege. "If you show the emperor the respect he deserves, I will waive the debt you owe me and my troops," he offered. "Your proposal honors you, but the edict spells our end," the delegates responded. "It will not come to that. The edict cannot stand. I promise you nothing will happen," Wallenstein assured them. Wallenstein was conducting his own policy. "I trust your word, but if you do not protect us, we will seek help from the Swedes," they warned. Wallenstein knew the edict posed a threat. He feared the Protestants might indeed find support. "Your Excellency, an alliance with the Swedes?" he questioned. "The emperor is risking everything by breaking the religious peace," they argued. Wallenstein had different goals. He was primarily concerned with not subjecting his army to unnecessary burdens. He ensured his troops were not recklessly risked, often contradicting the emperor when he saw such risks. The conflict between the emperor and the commander escalated in Regensburg. The electors aimed to exploit the situation, to drive a wedge between the monarch and the general. Both had become too powerful for the princes, the emperor through Wallenstein, and Wallenstein through the emperor. Even among Catholic rulers, there was discontent. Wallenstein was portrayed as a traitor for ignoring the Edict of Restitution. The Catholic electors reminded Ferdinand that the emperor should consult them, not just anyone, especially Maximilian of Bavaria. Your Imperial Majesty, Wallenstein's appointment as commander and the raising of his army happened without our consent, they said. An advisor defended the decision. Had we not acted then, we would all have been lost. But Wallenstein abuses his unprecedented powers to exploit us. Not even church properties were spared. How else could he raise and supply his army so quickly? He refuses to enforce your edict, Majesty. Will you defend him too? The emperor acknowledged Wallenstein's merits, but did not want to alienate the powerful princes. We, Ferdinand II, by God's grace, Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, German nation, King of Bohemia and Hungary, relieve you of command because imposing limitations on your authority would be unbearable. We will retain your services for future occasions and assure you of our protection. At least he relieves me of the responsibility for the Swedes, but he will regret his decision, Wallenstein said upon his dismissal. Another powerful figure entered German soil, King Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden. In July 1630, he landed on Usedom with his fleet. His motives were diverse. A significant reason for Gustavus Adolphus's intervention was to counter the emperor's dominance in northern Germany. He also had a religious agenda. The House of Vasa, which he represented, and the entire Kingdom of Sweden saw themselves as champions of the Protestant cause. Expansionism and religious mission were intertwined. The besieged Magdeburg became Sweden's first ally on German soil, but before help arrived, the troops of the imperial commander Tilly left behind a trail of devastation. It was like hell on earth. Of the 35,000 residents, every second person fell victim to the massacre. There was nothing but killing, burning, looting, torturing, and beating. Many thousands of innocent people, women and children, were miserably murdered and horribly executed in various ways, so much so that it cannot be described in words or wept with tears. An eyewitness report, silent witnesses of the catastrophe in Magdeburg Cathedral, survived the horror unscathed, but seem to mourn the downfall of their city to this day. Its destruction is considered the greatest catastrophe of the 30 Years' War. The dismay in the Protestant camp was so great that powerful coalitions formed. Gustavus Adolphus wanted to use the war in the empire to strengthen his own dominance in the Baltic region, and therefore presented himself to the German Protestants as the savior of the faith and defender of German freedom. However, the Protestant princes did not want to be saved by him. Only the burning of Magdeburg, which was a true signal, drove them into the arms of the Swedes. An originally unplanned and extraordinary triumphal march of the Swedes through the empire began, reaching down to Bavaria. Gustavus Adolphus seemed to want to take the place of the emperor. The Protestants saw their savior in the King of Sweden. Under his leadership, the tide turned. The imperial army had nothing to counter the Swedes and their allies. Wallenstein's prophecies seemed to be coming true. Under Gustavus Adolphus's watch, the Catholics in Bavaria felt the Protestants' revenge. In their violence against the rural population, the Swedish soldiers were no less brutal than the imperial soldiers. One of the most feared torture methods of the 30 Years' War was the so-called Swedish drink. Swedish mercenaries forced manure down their prisoners' throats, using a funnel until the victims were bloated, and then they beat or jumped on their stomachs until the victims revealed everything. This is just one indication of the brutality and horrors of the 30 Years' War, a war in which neither side, neither Catholics nor Protestants, remained innocent. In Munich, there was fear of retribution for Magdeburg. To avoid destruction, representatives of the citizenry handed over the city's keys to Gustavus Adolphus in May 1632. The King of Sweden triumphantly entered the Catholic stronghold of Munich. Where would his advance end? From the Munich residence, it was not far to Vienna, where the Habsburg Emperor reigned. Did Gustavus Adolphus aspire to join the gallery of great emperors and rise to become the Protestant emperor of the Germans? The Catholics were in distress. Not only in Bavaria were calls for a savior heard. The name Wallenstein was mentioned. In Lützen, the generalissimo returned to the war stage and once again led the imperial army. The emperor, remorseful, had reappointed him as supreme commander. The Swedes had taken Mecklenburg from him. As the emperor's general, Wallenstein wanted to challenge Gustavus Adolphus to a decisive battle. Wallenstein carefully devised a battle plan, pursuing a defensive strategy. His troops were deeply entrenched to face the Swedes. The opponents were evenly matched. On November 16, 1632, at 10 a.m., the first shots were fired. Each side had 18,000 men. "Anyone who cannot bring his squad into order will meet the hangman," Wallenstein declared. "Let's go." The tide of war seemed to turn against Wallenstein. "I can take over his flank," said Piccolomini. "Good, Piccolomini, but be quick. I will not yield a foot to Gustavus Adolphus." "Jesus Maria, Jesus Maria," the soldiers cried. The imperial troops launched a counterattack. Gustavus Adolphus responded with great firepower and personally led the counteroffensive. In the smoke of the battlefield, the nearsighted king lost his orientation and fell into a deadly trap. His death on the battlefield of Lützen would become a legend. The leather doublet he wore in battle against Wallenstein, with its fatal bullet hole in the back, became a relic for the Protestants. Initially, the Protestants denied his death. Long after the battle, they declared Gustavus Adolphus, whom they found in his blood-soaked shirt, a martyr. On the battlefield, the shots at the king so enraged the Swedes that Wallenstein himself was in mortal danger. Enemy projectiles struck all around him. It was only in the evening that the cannons fell silent. When Wallenstein came to, he realized he had narrowly escaped death. What he saw made him doubt for the first time. Many of his mercenaries had paid with their lives. The war entrepreneur saw no more sense in his deadly trade. The Battle of Lützen became a turning point for him as well. Of the 36,000 mercenaries on both sides, more than 8,000 remained on the battlefield. The King of Sweden had fallen, yet nothing was won. Wallenstein sought a way out. In his residence in Bohemian Gitchen, he convened a secret meeting. He wanted to negotiate with the Protestants. "We need a final settlement between the Catholics and the evangelicals. With the Emperor, that's impossible. He's to blame for everything. If there's no peace now, all will be lost. But Your Grace, the Emperor cannot be trusted. You know this from your own experience. What are you getting at? Have you forgotten your dismissal? Does he think of switching sides? The Emperor unfortunately trusts his confessor more than his own mind. Wallenstein, why are we still fighting each other? It would be easier to make peace with you than with the Emperor." Wallenstein wanted to bind himself to no one anymore, seeing himself as his own master. In his last years as generalissimo, Wallenstein increasingly aimed to make his army an autonomous power base. He distanced himself more and more from the imperial court, conducting his own policy independently. The emperor increasingly distrusted Wallenstein, who no longer did his bidding. The breaking point in their relationship came when Wallenstein refused to swear his officers' loyalty to the emperor, but instead to himself. To mention another famous event, There was the first Pilsner Rever. When the emperor learns of this, he is outraged. Now Wallenstein seeks to assure the loyalty of his men. Reports from his circle tell us that he aims to seize your crown. A conspiracy. But Wallenstein has always been loyal to me. He was my salvation against them and went to war against the Swedes on my behalf. The Swedes are now besieging Regensburg, and the Generalissimo does not intervene. I ordered Wallenstein to drive them away. What does he do instead? He negotiates with our enemies. You must finally stop him. The emperor's decree condemning Wallenstein is decided. Ferdinand fears the general more than he trusts him and seals his fate. Wallenstein seeks refuge in Bohemian Eger, feeling safe for now in the house of the city commander. Yet he knows he is being pursued. He does not realize how close his pursuers are, nor does he want to believe it. The foreign powers foretold by his horoscope now triumph over him. In the end, it is his own soldiers who hunt him down. The Kaiser has promised them a bounty to deliver the outlawed man to him, alive or dead. The soldiers are to decide between him and the Kaiser. They have made their choice. Traitorous dog, what do you want? Mercy. Mercy has not been given. He dies because he no longer wanted to wage war for others, especially not for faith. Wallenstein was an extraordinary person in his time. He thought in economic terms, and organization meant a lot to him. Yet this made him foreign to the people of his time, and it seemed very strange to them because law and confession meant relatively little to him in his leadership. The emperor valued the immense power he gained through Wallenstein, but he could not really use it because this generalissimo, had no goals for which he himself stood. Wallenstein was concerned with the army, with the functioning of this army. In this respect, Kaiser Ferdinand continued his war for power and faith with the blessing of the Church. Yet 1 year after Wallenstein's death, he also recognized that there would be no winners in this war, and that the opponents had to come together. In the spring of 1635, the German princes of both confessions and delegates of the Kaiser met in Prague Castle, where the spiral of violence was triggered. 17 years had passed since the defenestration of Prague. Now Protestants and Catholics in Prague are making peace for the beloved fatherland of the noble German nation. The Prague Peace was an attempt to establish a constitutional and confessional peace at the imperial level. It failed because they consistently wanted to push the foreign crowns, the European powers, out of this war and conclude peace without the participation of these foreign powers. Ultimately, the Prague Peace failed because it was no longer possible to conclude a peace treaty without involving France and Sweden. In Prague, it was about a reconciliation between the German princes and the Kaiser. Yet the French felt surrounded by the Habsburgs, who ruled in the Empire and in Spain. Thus, Catholic France allied with Protestant Sweden to fight against imperial power. The noble German land, which stood in full bloom, waited and still waits today, a counterpart to itself and the prey of foreign peoples. Poets like Opitz created an awareness of the common destiny of the Germans, internally shattered and a victim of foreign powers, alone in suffering. They see the uniting bond, as Andreas Gryphius did in his Tears of the Fatherland. We are now more than completely destroyed, yet I remain silent about what is worse than death, more terrible than plague and fire and hunger, that also the treasure of souls, so many are taken away, more than a third of the civilian population falls victim to this war through violence, disease, and hunger. This war was unleashed in the name of faith, and ends with the certainty that any further shedding of blood is senseless. Only in 1645, 11 years after Wallenstein's death, did envoys of the warring parties set out to conclude a lasting peace. Delegates from across Europe gathered in the spared cities of Osnabrück and Münster in Westphalia. The peace negotiations lasted for 3 years. Never before in history had so many powers come together to conclude an agreement for an entire continent. Ultimately, the delegates struggled for a solution, knowing that only a balance between the powerful and the confessions could bring peace. In 1648, the council chamber of Münster became the scene of a historic agreement. Here, for the first time at a European Congress, a European Order of Peace was established, which is a legal order and an equal order of the individual countries of Europe. The wars have not been eliminated, but a fundamentalist war like the 30 Years' War has not been conducted since. In the Peace of Westphalia of 1648, the signatories sought a balance in the heart of Europe to reconcile the power and religious differences. It became the basic law of the empire. The confessional division and territorial fragmentation of Germany were established. This is the price for the longed-for peace. The empire remains an association determined by the sovereigns of different-sized territories. The empire has continued to exist, but it has not become a central monarchy. Instead, it has persisted as a federal defensive association focused on defense. In doing so, it has embraced and confirmed the federal traditions deeply rooted in German history. One can see lines of tradition here that stretch from the 16th century through 1648, 1949, to Germany in 1990. The news of the conclusion of peace spread throughout the empire within a few days. Thank God, now the noble word of peace and joy has resounded, that now spears and swords and their murder shall rest. O Germany, sing songs in a high full choir, a thanksgiving from that time, a kingdom, a ruler, a confession. This vision led to unrestrained violence. Power and faith remain divided on German soil, and there can only be peace with and not against the neighbors in Europe. Please support us by subscribing to the channel and liking the video.